up with a few people who actually couldn't find anybody at all that they really sort of felt okay with. He put them into a group. He then asked them to talk to each other about their stories, where they've come from, who they were. Now, what was fascinating is in each of these groups, these people had very similar sort of childhood stories. Now, you'd know that most people who want to do family therapy, you actually, if you want to be a therapist, you've probably got a bit of stuff. You know, you've probably been somewhere, haven't you? Because otherwise, if you had any sense, you'd open a flower shop, wouldn't you, really, rather than... So, you know, everybody's a wounded healer. But these people were wounded in similar ways. So we know that all that happens before anybody even opens their mouths, you know, that all that is going on. So, you know, there's a whole lot of stuff there. What we also know is that actually, well, actually, I'll start again. What we have, I want to talk to you about, in a sense, 3 stages of the couple relationship. I want to talk to you about a stage that we would call the stage that we would call ideal. I want to talk to you about the stage that we would call ordeal, that follows the ideal. Anyone know what the 3rd stage might be? No deal. Well, interestingly, it's real deal. This is Harville Hendricks, if you know, who's behind imago therapy. He talked about ideal, ordeal, and real deal. My wife told me about no deal. We're still married, you understand. This was in the course of an academic conversation. But so I want to try and hold that in mind. But I also want to talk to you about some of the things that go on, some of the very chemical things that go on too in the brain when we're in, because the ideal phase is a phase that can last from 18 months up to sort of 3 years. And actually, it's quite a drug-like phase. Helen Fisher, again in the States, put people who'd fallen in love in a functional MRI brain scanner to sort of see what was going on. Actually, she also put people who she described had just been dumped, which seems a bit cruel, doesn't it, really? Get in the scanner, we're going to have a look at your brain, you know. And interestingly, she found that, you know, the same bit of the brain lights up for both, which is quite interesting for those that have just been rejected. But it's a part of the brain, it's called the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, okay? It's right in, really deep down in midbrain. If you think of the brain like this, as the brain stem, the frontal cortex, the limbic system, somewhere where my glasses are, right down in the middle. It's below cognition and below emotion, you know? It is the part of the brain that is associated with cravings and drug addiction. It's the same bit that lights up, particularly cocaine and stimulant addiction. Okay, so already I think you start to get an idea why it might be a bit complicated when you fall in love if you're in recovery, because you've sort of been there before, yeah? So that's really interesting, and the PEAs that are you know, the VTA, you don't need to really know about this stuff particularly, but the chemicals, PEAs, that are on the end of the nerve endings that really help all these electrical impulses to jump across the synapses. You know, that's what's responsible for that sort of high feeling. You know, the feeling during this ideal phase, the feeling of falling in love, where, you know, we're focused. You know, we're focused, we've got energy, everything's okay, forget the chores, this is what I want. You know, it really focuses us, you know, on one person. You know, it's the same focus that has people tolerating all sorts of crazy things. You know, oh, I love the way he farts and burps. You know, I love the way she bites her toenails. Do you know? The sort of stuff that is just so blinkered, the sort of stuff that in active addiction has people missing the fact that actually, you know, he might be a sex addict, or, you know, she's got financial addictions, or any of that sort of stuff. And this stuff will happen to people in recovery too. So, you know, so we know already something very powerful goes on chemically there. And I'm going to have to just have a quick look, and I'm sorry about this. Okay, there's an interesting guy in the States called John Gottman, Professor John Gottman. I don't know if you know about him. He's from the University of Washington. He studied couples as well, actually. And they set up a sort of Big Brother type house attached to the med school at Washington. And they've studied couples for over sort of 30 years. He has them in for sort of a couple of days. And they're wired up to to some machines. They're checking for sort of physiological sort of things going on. There's cameras going on. They're testing urine for stress hormones. And they're really observing all these couples. He thinks, and there's good clinical data about this, that he can predict whether a couple are going to stay together. What he claims is 95% accuracy, based entirely on the way that the couples communicate. And he's saying that actually, the couples that don't stay together, what they have very high levels of four things that he calls the four horsemen. Okay? One is criticism. The statements that are not I feel statements, the one that, God, you're always late, you're not interested in me at all, this is typical. The criticism. The other is a defensiveness, which is often a response to the criticism, but an inability to say, oh yeah, I fucked it up this time, sorry about that. The third, and actually the biggest predictor, is contempt, which is really the name calling. Actually, I'm above you. Do you know? The contempt. Which, interestingly, is also a predictor for the person who's actually received the contempt, actually is quite a marker for illness for the next 4 years when people do separate. Because it's an enormous attack on the system, actually, when you've been treated contemptuously. And the fourth thing that he talks about is what he calls stonewalling, which is pretty much when the listener turns away and doesn't want to take any notice, And that's an interesting one, because for a lot of people, stonewalling actually is also a defense that when people are being talked to, actually it can just overwhelm them and they go into a place that's sort of speechless or they turn away. And that, of course, can really be quite aggravating. So these four things, these four horsemen, as he calls it, criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. So I think, all that stuff is really fascinating. This is before we start talking about mum and dad. Yeah? So, he also, interestingly, he also talks about, he has this sort of phrase that I don't really like. He talks about the sort of masters and disasters, the disasters being the people who don't stay together, and the masters. And he talks about the people who do stay together. And what he's saying is, what we observe is they're quite gentle with one another. They can take responsibility. They can say sorry. They can just I mucked it up. It's a much more just sort of gentle thing. So I think that's all rather fascinating. Now, one of the things so let's keep thinking about these stages: the ideal, the ordeal, the no deal, or the real deal. That during the ideal phase, okay, when all these drugs, when the VTA is really active, there's also a real sense of merging. It's the time where actually we just want to do everything together. It's the time that people in recovery maybe don't go to so many meetings, don't pick up the phone. It's the time we just want to be together. We find, oh gosh, we're wearing the same jumpers. It's all that. There's a real, it's a time of merging, which is chemically driven. Now, there's a problem here, because for many people in recovery, they come actually from situations of suboptimal parenting. So actually, for a lot of them, that feeling of merging wasn't there. If you think about love addiction is the hunger for attachment, isn't it? That has people acting against their best interests. Yeah? So actually, that feeling of merging, not only does it hey, we're taking drugs again, it's also wow, I'm getting what I always wanted. This is what I needed. To be held in mind, to be unconditionally loved, to have whatever I do. The fact that I wear the same T-shirt for a week and it really pongs, she just loves that. I can be loved unconditionally, which of course is rubbish in the adult relationship. But I can be loved unconditionally. So we've got the merging. Going on. I guess the other thing, one of my favourite couple therapists is a lady called Esther Perel. She wrote a great book, you may know it, called Mating in Captivity. It's such a great title, I wish I'd thought of that. And she makes a really important point, because what she discovered, traditionally in couple therapy, there's been this idea that, if we can just get the intimacy right, then actually, that the sex will be really good. That good sex follows people being very close and emotionally intimate. But actually what she started to discover, and I completely believe she's right, is that actually is often not the case. Because actually in the couple relationship, we have a conflict between the desire for security and the desire for adventure. And actually what she's saying that I know from my experience as a couple therapist, if I ask people, when do you find him attractive? Usually when they're having a big standoff about each other, so it's quite good to take it back to something rather positive, which also in couple therapy, it's a very good place to begin with. How did you meet? Just to remind these people that they fell in love before they started beating the stuff out of each other. But when do you find him attractive? When do you find her attractive? And you know what they'll say? They'll always say, they won't say, oh, it's when we're across a dinner table in the candlelight. They'll say, I went into his office actually, and to the works, but I saw him interacting with all his with all his colleagues, and I saw, I really fancied him. He'll say, I went to see her doing something. I went to her work. I saw her giving a talk. I don't often see that. I really fancied him. Attractiveness and the erotic exists in the space between two. Okay? So already we have this sort of conflict between the merging, which might give us security and all of that and intimacy, but actually very often can actually kill some of the sexuality and attractiveness. Yeah? But that requires separateness. In order to be able to do that, you have to actually be separate. And this word separate is a key word actually, because I guess what I would say to you that actually for the couple relationship, and of course particularly for the couple relationship in recovery, in order to be one, you need to be two. And this is a really difficult concept. And I'll go on and say a bit about why that is the case. And the couple relationship also, of course, requires quite a bit of work around boundaries, which is also a real difficulty, isn't it, for people in recovery? Because, when two people form a couple, they deal with boundaries, don't they? What's okay, what's not okay? Not at the beginning when they're wearing the same jumpers, but after a while, once you start getting into ordeal, it's like, well, do we stay in? Do we go out? How tidy do we keep this place? Is it okay if I put my cup in the sink rather than straight in the dishwasher? Which is one of the things you hear mostly, by the way, in couple therapy, is a complaint. Is that how do we spend our money? Do I always have to go to your family for Christmas or Easter? Do I have to go with you? Is it okay if I still see my ex-girlfriends? Is it okay if you still see your ex-girlfriend? How do we manage? It's all about boundaries of sort of zones of what's private and what isn't private. Zones of togetherness, zones of privacy. So there's an awful lot of stuff. Again, for people who have difficulty being separate, this is a real problem. Because for many people, and again, people brought up in these suboptimal, so-called dysfunctional families, actually, difference is quite life-threatening. Difference is abandoning. So, and for some people particularly harmed, so for a lot of the love addicts, often never actually really get out of ideal. They're forever, their systems, their brains are forever being washed with these PEA chemicals, really, in the ideal stage, but with a different person each time. Because actually the feelings of the negotiating difference is so complicated, because actually if she wants to stay in one evening and wash her hair, she doesn't want to be with me anymore. I've been rejected. If he wants to go out with his mates, what's wrong with me? I think this is the end. I'm pretty sure this is the end of the relationship. And for a lot of those people, these powerful early experiences that become, because of course everything that we do and feel is a neural experience. It's all a neural pathway. It's all about chemicals up here. People just stay in the cycle of ideal, just sort of washed with in the next. And in therapy and treating the love addict, I always think it's quite fascinating, because you've actually only got a small window of time between the end of one relationship and the beginning of the other, which is when they'll come in. Because the danger is actually there might be another person and I think I'm okay now. I don't think I really need. And actually a lot of love addicts, of course, come to therapy. Why do they come? To try and work out what they need to do